Does the government work for us or do we work for the government? How much longer can the federal government keep borrowing real money from investors and fake money from the Federal Reserve? Tonight, government borrowing and personal freedom. During the past 2 months or so, since the current Congress came to power, the one with all the Tea Party-backed candidates in the House and a few in the Senate, Freedom Watch has been watching these folks as they address the issue of debt. Debt was not always a problem in American history. Yes, there was debt around at the time of each major war, as the federal government borrowed money at high interest rates to pay for the wars. Those debts were mostly paid off by sales of federal land, tariffs on imports, user fees, and taxes. Debt did not start to get serious until the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was the original nanny-stater in the White House. He was also a racist and a segregationist, and he hated immigrants and Catholics. But he was a former professor and president of Princeton University, my own alma mater, and he really thought he could use the power of the federal government to tell Americans how to live their lives. Under his presidency, among other monstrosities, the Federal Reserve was created, and under his presidency, its money printing machine was started. And at the end of his presidency was the first Fed-induced banking crisis of the early 1920s. After all presidents after Wilson, all, from conservatives like Warren Harding and Ronald Reagan, to liberals like Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, to socialists like FDR and President Obama, used the Fed to finance the government's wars and social programs. And they also used the Fed to address the government's debt. So, for example, if the United States Treasury had borrowed $1 billion in 1940, and it was time to pay back the billion in 1970, for sure it didn't have that billion to pay back. So in 1970, it borrowed another billion from investors and from the Fed to pay back the billion it owed to the investors and the Fed who had loaned it to them in 1940. I know that is ridiculous, but that's how the government has been doing business since the Fed came along. The government borrows from Peter to pay Paul. Interest rates were higher in 1970 than they were in 1940, so it was costing the taxpayers serious money just to pay back the billion. But that's what the government did. When investors lend money to the government, that money is removed from the productive side of the economy because the government doesn't make money, it consumes it. It doesn't create jobs and it doesn't create wealth. Where do investors get the money from that they loan to the government? They either borrow it at an interest rate less than what the government is paying them, or they remove it from their savings. Whatever the source, it just adds to the government's debt. When the Federal Reserve, however, lends money to the Treasury, it creates that money out of thin air. That meant that until the 1980s, it literally printed cash and deposited the cash in an account of a member bank, and then that bank wrote a check to the Treasury as a loan. Since the 1980s and the advent of electronic banking, the Fed merely added zeros to the bank account of a member bank, and then that bank wrote a check to the Treasury. If you or I did this, we'd be arrested. In either case, by printing money or by digitally creating it, the Fed increased the money supply. The money supply is the total amount of cash and credit in banks and in circulations in the United States. When the Fed does this, it increases the wealth of its banker friends, but it reduces the wealth of the rest of us. You see, the monetary system is elastic. When you add $1 billion at one end, there is a reaction at the other end. The other end would be consumers, you and me. And the reaction at that other end is higher prices. Inflation has only one cause: too much money chasing too few goods. Inflation is the result of the Fed lending money that it has created to the government. Oh, and that $1 billion debt that the Treasury paid back in 1970, the one it owed since 1940, it became $1.1 billion when the Feds paid it back in 1970. That's what happens when you borrow new money to pay back an old loan. And that brings us to today. Today, the federal government, after generations of doing this, has a debt of $14 trillion. Today, the president has no interest in reducing that debt, only adding to it. Today, 25% of all tax revenue that the government collects from you goes to paying interest on that debt. Today, the president wants to add to that tax burden. Today, the federal government of the United States collects over $200 billion every month from taxpayers. Today, the federal government of the United States is about to run out of cash. Today, the government's borrowing raises your taxes and lowers the value of your cash and your house and your property. It steals your property and your freedom. And it is time that this was stopped. Will Republicans in the House say no? If they do, they can turn this debt-ridden monster around. If they don't, who can ever trust them again? Tomorrow on Freedom Watch, two fierce defenders of sound money and personal freedom, Congressman Ron Paul and Professor Walter Williams. From New York, defending freedom every night of the week. So long, America.